The morning sun filtered through the towering glass windows of Elias Carver's penthouse office, casting long, golden streaks across the polished mahogany desk. At 42, Elias was the enigmatic CEO of Carver Enterprises, a sprawling network of retail stores he'd inherited and reshaped over the past decade. His sharp hazel eyes scanned the quarterly report, but his mind wasn't on the profit margins or sales spikes. Instead, it lingered on a single email that had landed in his inbox late the previous night, an anonymous tip from one of his 22 locations, a small store nestled in the heart of a quiet Midwestern town. "Check store 17, the email read, its tone clipped and urgent. "They let Margaret go after 35 years. No reason, no notice, just gone. You need to see what's happening there." Elias leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm against the armrest. Margaret Ellison. The name tugged at a memory, vague but persistent. She'd been a fixture at store 17 since before he'd taken over the company, a maintenance worker who'd started when the store was just a single brick-and-mortar outpost. 35 years. That kind of loyalty wasn't just rare, it was the backbone of what Elias had always believed his company stood for. He'd grown Carver Enterprises from a faltering chain into a thriving empire, not by slashing costs or cutting corners, but by investing in people. His father, the previous owner, had run the business like a machine, employees were cogs, replaceable and expendable. Elias had promised himself he'd be different. He'd implemented policies to protect long-term workers, to reward dedication. And yet, here was evidence that his vision had frayed at the edges. Margaret's dismissal wasn't just a personnel issue, it was a betrayal of everything he'd built. Elias pushed the report aside and stood, pacing to the window. Below, the city hummed with life, oblivious to the storm brewing in his mind. Store 17 was one of the smaller locations, a place he hadn't visited in years. The managers filed their reports on time, the numbers were steady, nothing had ever flagged it as a problem. But numbers didn't tell the whole story, did they? He couldn't rely on spreadsheets or middlemen anymore. If something was rotting in his company, he needed to root it out himself. By noon, Elias had made up his mind. He wouldn't storm in as the CEO, all tailored suits and corporate authority. That would only spook the staff, bury the truth under layers of polished excuses. No, he'd go in quietly, unseen, a shadow slipping into the cracks. He called his assistant, Lila, into the office. She entered with her usual brisk efficiency, tablet in hand, ready for his next directive. "Cancel my meetings for the next week," Elias said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm going off-grid. No one knows where I'm headed, not even the board." Lila's brow furrowed, but she didn't question him. She'd worked with Elias long enough to recognize the glint in his eyes, determination laced with something fiercer. "Anything else?" "Get me a car. Something nondescript. And a burner phone." He paused, then added, "I'll handle the rest." By evening, Elias had transformed himself. The sleek black hair he usually kept neatly styled was now tousled and dyed a muted ash blonde. He traded his custom suits for a worn denim jacket, a faded gray t-shirt, and scuffed boots he'd dug out of a thrift store bag he'd bought on impulse. A pair of cheap wire-framed glasses perched on his nose, smudged just enough to look authentic. He slouched slightly, softening the confident posture that usually defined him. In the mirror, he didn't see Elias Carver, billionaire CEO. He saw Ethan Reed, a drifter looking for a fresh start. The drive to store 17 took 6 hours, the kind of journey that let his thoughts spiral. What had happened to Margaret? Why had she been let go? And who had made the call? The anonymous email hadn't named names, but Elias had a sinking feeling it pointed to the store manager, a man named Victor Hensley. Victor had been with the company for 8 years, promoted to store 17 after a string of solid performance reviews. Elias had never met him in person, another oversight he now regretted. When he arrived, the store loomed ahead, its faded sign flickering in the dusk. It was smaller than most of his locations, a single-story building with peeling paint and a parking lot dotted with potholes. Elias parked his beat-up sedan at the far end and sat for a moment, watching. Employees trickled out from a side door, their shoulders slumped, their voices hushed. The air felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. He stepped out, grabbed a crumpled resume he'd mocked up on the burner phone's notes app, and headed inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on scuffed linoleum floors. A young cashier glanced up from the register, her expression blank. "Hear about the maintenance job?" she asked, barely waiting for his nod before pointing to the back. "Victor's in the office. Good luck." Elias, Ethan, now, shuffled toward the rear of the store, his boots dragging slightly to sell the act. He knocked on the office door, and a gruff voice barked, "Come in." Victor Hensley was a stocky man in his late 40s, with thinning hair and a permanent scowl etched into his face. He sat behind a cluttered desk, a half-eaten burger in one hand, a stack of paperwork shoved to the side. He didn't stand, didn't even look up fully. "You Ethan?" Victor asked, his tone clipped. "Yes, sir," Elias said, pitching his voice lower, rougher. "Saw the job posting online." Victor snorted, finally meeting his gaze. "Sir, huh? Don't get much of that around here. You ever cleaned a store before?" "Some," Elias lied. "Worked a warehouse gig last year. Mopped floors, fixed leaks, whatever they needed." Victor grunted, unimpressed. "Fine. You're hired. Start tonight, 11 p.m. shift. We're down a guy, so you'll be pulling doubles till we figure it out. Pays minimum, take it or leave it." Elias nodded, keeping his face neutral. "I'll take it." "Good. Don't screw up." Victor waved him off, already turning back to his burger. As Elias left the office, he felt the first spark of unease. Down a guy. Was that Margaret? He needed answers, but he couldn't push too hard, not yet. He spent the next few hours wandering the store, pretending to familiarize himself with the layout. The shelves were half-stocked, the floors streaked with grime. Employees moved like automatons, their eyes downcast, their conversations clipped. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was defeat. At the break room, he lingered near a cluster of workers grabbing coffee from a stained pot. A wiry man in his 30s, with a name tag reading, Jake, muttered to a woman beside him, "Place has been a mess since Margaret left." The woman, whose tag read, Tessa, sighed. "Yeah, well, Victor didn't care. Said she was dead weight. 35 years, and he calls her that." Elias's grip tightened on the cheap styrofoam cup he'd picked up. Dead weight. The words burned into him, fueling a quiet rage. He stayed silent, listening as Jake lowered his voice. "She didn't even fight it. Just packed her stuff and left. Heard she's in some trailer park now, barely scraping by." Tessa shook her head. "Should have been Victor out the door, not her." The break ended, and the workers dispersed, leaving Elias alone with his thoughts. Margaret hadn't just been fired, she'd been discarded, erased from a place she'd given her life to. And Victor, sitting in his office with his greasy burger, had done it without a second thought. Elias's jaw clenched. He'd come here to see the truth, and now he had a glimpse of it. But this was just the beginning. He needed to know more, about Margaret, about Victor, about the rot festering in store 17. And then, he'd act. As the clock ticked toward his first shift, Elias vowed one thing: whoever had wronged Margaret would answer for it. Not tomorrow, not next week, now. He'd tear this place apart if he had to, brick by brick, until justice was more than just a word. The clock struck 11 p.m., and Elias Carver, now Ethan Reed, stepped into store 17 under the flickering glow of its tired neon sign. The night shift was a different beast, quieter but heavier, as if the store itself exhaled a long-held breath of despair. The air smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, a scent that clung to the cracked linoleum and the worn-out souls who shuffled through it. Elias carried a mop and bucket, his tools of disguise, but his real weapon was his attention. Every glance, every whisper, he catalogued it all. His first task was simple: clean the aisles. He moved deliberately, dragging the mop in slow, methodical strokes, blending into the background. The overnight crew was sparse, just 5 workers, including him. There was Jake, the wiry man from the break room, restocking shelves with a rhythm that spoke of habit rather than enthusiasm. Tessa, the woman who'd mourned Margaret's exit, manned the lone register, her eyes darting to the clock every few minutes. 2 others, a lanky teenager named Sam and a middle-aged woman named Carla, handled inventory in the back. And then there was Victor, holed up in his office, the faint glow of his computer screen seeping under the door. Elias worked in silence, letting the crew's guarded conversations drift to him. At first, it was mundane: complaints about sore feet, a debate over whose turn it was to empty the trash. But as the hours wore on and the store emptied of its last straggling customers, the talk turned sharper. "Victor's been on edge since Margaret," Jake said, his voice low as he shoved cans onto a shelf. "Snapped at me yesterday over a spilled soda. Like I'm the one who made the mess." Tessa snorted, leaning against the counter. "He's always been a jerk, but yeah, it's worse now. Probably knows he screwed up." "Screwed up?" Sam piped up, pausing with a box cutter in hand. "Didn't he fire her? Sounds like he meant to do it." Carla emerged from the stockroom, wiping her hands on her apron. "Meant to or not, it was stupid. Margaret knew this place better than anyone. Half the stuff's falling apart without her." Elias kept his head down, letting the mop swish across the floor. Margaret's absence wasn't just a wound, it was a fracture, splintering the store's fragile ecosystem. He needed more. He needed her story. "Anyone know where she went?" he asked, keeping his tone casual, almost bored. The question hung in the air, and for a moment, he thought he'd overplayed his hand. Then Tessa glanced his way, sizing him up. "You're new, huh? Ethan, right?" she said. He nodded, and she softened slightly. "Margaret's at Pineview Trailer Park, last I heard. Not far, just a few miles east. But don't expect her to talk about it. She's broken, you know." 35 years, Jake muttered, shaking his head. "I'd be broken too if they threw me out like that." Elias let the conversation fade, storing the name, Pineview Trailer Park, in his mind like a key. He finished his sweep of the aisles, then moved to the restrooms, where the real decay of store 17 revealed itself. Cracked tiles, a leaking sink, graffiti scratched into the stall doors, it was a mess Margaret had likely kept at bay for decades. Now, it festered, a silent testament to her absence. By 3 a.m., the crew took a break, gathering in the cramped back room. Elias joined them, sipping bitter coffee from a chipped mug. Victor hadn't emerged from his office, but his presence loomed like a storm cloud. Elias seized the moment. "Why'd he do it?" he asked, directing the question at no one in particular. "Fire her, I mean." Jake shrugged, tearing open a bag of chips. "Victor's obsessed with efficiency. Said she was too slow, cost too much to keep around. Never mind, she did the work of 3 people. Cost too much?" Carla scoffed. "She wasn't even full-time anymore. Took a pay cut years ago just to stay on." Elias's stomach twisted. A pay cut to stay. Margaret had clung to this place, not for greed, but for something deeper, pride, purpose, maybe even love. And Victor had ripped it away. He pressed further, careful not to sound too eager. No warning? Nope, Tessa said, her voice tight. Came in one morning, and he called her to the office. 10 minutes later, she was gone. Didn't even let her finish her shift. She tried to argue, Jake added. Heard her voice through the door, shaky but firm. Said she'd work harder, take less hours, anything. Victor just told her to pack up and get out. The room fell silent, the weight of the story settling over them. Elias stared into his coffee, his knuckles white around the mug. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was cruelty, cold and calculated. Victor hadn't just fired Margaret, he'd humiliated her, stripped her of dignity after 35 years of service. And for what? A few dollars saved? A line on a budget report? The break ended, and Elias returned to his tasks, but his mind raced. He needed to see Margaret, to hear her side, to understand the full scope of what he was dealing with. But first, he had to survive Victor's scrutiny. The manager finally emerged at 5 a.m., bleary-eyed and irritable, barking orders as if the night shift hadn't already stretched them thin. Ethan, you missed a spot by the freezers, Victor snapped, jabbing a finger toward the back. Fix it before you clock out. Elias nodded, biting back the retort that rose in his throat. He mopped the spot, pristine already, just Victor flexing his petty power, and watched as the manager retreated to his office. The crew exchanged knowing looks, a silent pact of endurance. Elias felt a flicker of camaraderie, a bond forged in shared frustration. These people weren't just employees, they were survivors, holding the store together despite Victor's reign. When his shift ended at 7 a.m., Elias didn't head to the cheap motel he'd checked into. Instead, he drove east, the sunrise painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Pineview Trailer Park was a cluster of weathered trailers tucked off a winding road, surrounded by scraggly pines and gravel paths. He parked near the entrance and scanned the rows, unsure where to start. An elderly man smoking on a porch noticed him and waved him over. Looking for someone, the man rasped, eyeing Elias's disheveled appearance. Margaret Ellison, Elias said, keeping his voice neutral. Heard she's here. The man nodded, pointing to a faded blue trailer at the end of the lane. Number 12. She don't come out much these days. Elias thanked him and approached the trailer, his boots crunching on the gravel. The place was modest, its paint chipped, a single potted plant wilting by the door. He knocked twice, the sound sharp in the morning stillness. A long pause followed, then the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 60s. Margaret Ellison was shorter than he'd imagined, her frame slight but wiry, her gray hair pulled into a loose bun. Her eyes, though, sharp and weary, held a fire that hadn't quite died. Who are you? She asked, her tone guarded. Name's Ethan, Elias said, sticking to his cover. I work at store 17. Heard what happened. Just wanted to check on you. Margaret's gaze hardened, and she stepped back, leaving the door ajar. Come in, then. But don't expect me to cry on your shoulder. Inside, the trailer was sparse but tidy, a small couch, a table with a single chair, a stack of books in the corner. Margaret sat, gesturing for Elias to do the same. He perched on the couch, feeling the weight of her scrutiny. They sent you? She asked, suspicion lacing her words. No, he said quickly. I'm new. Started last night. The others, they miss you. I needed to know why you're not there. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, he thought she'd shut him out. Then she sighed, a sound heavy with years. 35 years, I gave that store. Fixed pipes, scrubbed floors, patched walls, whatever they needed. Never asked for much. Just a paycheck and a place to belong. She paused, her hands folding in her lap. Then Victor calls me in. Says I'm inefficient. Says the company's moving forward, and I don't fit. Didn't even look me in the eye, just handed me a box and told me to go. Elias leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. You didn't deserve that. Margaret's eyes met his, a flicker of surprise in them. Maybe not. But deserving's got nothing to do with it. Victor wanted me gone, and that was that. He wanted to tell her who he was, to promise he'd fix it, but he held back. Not yet. He needed her trust, and he needed Victor exposed. I'm sorry, he said instead, meaning it more than she could know. She shrugged, but her shoulders trembled slightly. Don't be. Just keep your head down. Victor chews up anyone who steps out of line. Elias left the trailer with a fire in his chest. Margaret wasn't broken, she was bent, waiting for a chance to spring back. And he'd give her that chance. Victor had no idea what was coming. The sky was still bruised with the last traces of dawn when Elias Carver pulled into the parking lot of Store 17. He'd barely slept, his mind churning with Margaret's words, her quiet strength, and the festering injustice that had driven her from this place. Today, he wouldn't slink in as Ethan Reed, the unassuming janitor. Today, he'd walk through those doors as himself, Elias Carver, CEO of Carver Enterprises, and dismantle the rot he'd uncovered. His denim jacket was gone, replaced by a crisp charcoal suit, his ash blonde dye washed out to reveal the jet black hair that framed his sharp features. The glasses were discarded, and his posture straightened, carrying the weight of authority he'd set aside for days. Inside, the store buzzed with the early morning shift. Workers glanced up as he entered, their eyes widening at the stranger in their midst. Elias didn't pause to explain, he strode toward the back office, his steps deliberate, echoing against the linoleum. The door was ajar, and Victor Hensley sat inside, hunched over a stack of schedules, a pen tapping irritably against the desk. He didn't look up until Elias filled the doorway, casting a shadow across the cluttered room. Who the hell are you? Victor grumbled, squinting through the haze of his own impatience. Elias shut the door with a quiet click, the sound cutting through the tension like a blade. Elias Carver, he said, his voice low and steady. I own this company. Victor's pen froze mid-tap, his face paling as recognition sank in. He scrambled to his feet, knocking a coffee mug to the floor in the process. The crash was loud, but Elias didn't flinch. Mr. Carver, I didn't know you were. Sit, Elias interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. Victor dropped back into his chair, his bravado evaporating. Elias remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze piercing. I've been here for 3 days. Working under you. Watching. Victor's mouth opened, then closed, a fish gasping for air. Working, here? As Ethan Reed, Elias said. The new maintenance hire. I mopped your floors, cleaned your restrooms, listened to your staff. And I saw exactly what you've done to this place. Victor's eyes darted to the door, as if plotting an escape, but Elias stepped closer, his presence pinning the manager in place. Let's talk about Margaret Ellison, he continued. 35 years of service, and you fired her. No warning, no severance, just a box and a shove out the door. Why? Victor shifted, his fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. She was slowing down, he said, his voice thin. Couldn't keep up with the workload. I had to make a call, cut costs, keep things efficient. Efficient? Elias's voice sharpened, a blade unsheathed. She took a pay cut to stay on. Worked harder than most of your crew combined. And you call her inefficient? She was old, Victor snapped, a flicker of defiance breaking through his fear. This isn't a retirement home. I needed someone younger, faster. You needed her gone, Elias cut in, because she was a reminder of what this company used to value, loyalty, dedication. You threw that away for a few bucks on a spreadsheet. Victor's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Elias leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. You didn't have the authority to fire her like that. Company policy requires a review for anyone with over 20 years of service. You bypassed it. Why? I run this store, Victor said, his tone rising. I don't need some corporate handbook telling me how to. You don't run anything anymore, Elias said, straightening. The words landed like a gavel, final and unyielding. Victor blinked, his bravado crumbling into confusion. You're firing me? He asked, a bitter laugh escaping him. Over a janitor? For breaking policy, Elias corrected. For treating your staff like disposable parts. For sitting in this office while they scramble to keep this place afloat. Margaret wasn't the only one you hurt. Jake's hours were cut, Tessa's been pulling doubles with no overtime pay, Carla's been doing inventory alone because you won't hire help. This stops now. Victor surged to his feet, his face reddening. You think you can waltz in here and play savior? This store's been fine under me. Fine? Elias gestured toward the door. Look out there. Shelves half empty, floors filthy, employees on the edge of collapse. That's your fine? Victor's hands balled into fists, but before he could retort, Elias pulled out his phone and dialed security. I want Mr. Hensley escorted off the premises, he said into the receiver. Immediately. The call ended, and Victor stared, incredulous. You're serious? Deadly, Elias replied. Within minutes, 2 uniformed guards appeared at the door. Victor grabbed his jacket, muttering curses under his breath as he was ushered out. Employees gathered near the front, watching in stunned silence as their manager stormed into the parking lot, his shouts fading into the morning air. Elias stepped out of the office, facing the small crowd. The air was thick with uncertainty, workers clutched brooms and scanners, their eyes darting between him and the exit. He took a breath, steadying himself. My name is Elias Carver, he said, his voice carrying across the store. I'm the CEO of Carver Enterprises. For the past few days, I've been here as Ethan, working alongside you. I came because I heard about Margaret Ellison, and what I found was worse than I imagined. A murmur rippled through the group. Tessa stepped forward, her arms crossed. So what now? You fire Victor and leave us to pick up the pieces? No, Elias said. I'm here to fix this. Starting with you. He turned to Jake. Your hours, how many were cut? Jake hesitated, then said, 10 a week. Been that way for months. You've got them back, Elias said. Full-time, effective today. Same goes for anyone else who's been shorted. No more understaffing. No more stretching you thin. The murmurs grew louder, a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. Carla raised a hand, her voice tentative. What about Margaret? Elias met her gaze. I saw her yesterday. She's coming back, if she wants to. Her job's waiting, with back pay for every day she's been gone. The room shifted, the tension easing into something lighter. Tessa's arms uncrossed, and Jake exhaled a breath he'd been holding. Sam, the teenager, grinned faintly. Elias wasn't done. He spent the next hour listening, really listening, as the staff unloaded months, years, of grievances. Broken equipment left unrepaired, schedules thrown together with no regard for their lives, Victor's dismissive sneers, it poured out, raw and unfiltered. Elias took notes on his phone, firing off emails to his team with each issue raised. By mid-morning, a new manager was en route, policies were being rewritten, and a maintenance crew was scheduled to tackle the store's neglect. But Elias's mind kept drifting to Margaret. He'd exposed Victor, started the repairs, but this wasn't finished until she walked through those doors again. He slipped out during a lull, driving back to Pineview Trailer Park. The gravel crunched under his tires as he parked near her trailer, the wilted plant still guarding the doorstep. He knocked, and this time, the door opened faster. Margaret stood there, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took in his suit, his polished shoes. "Ethan, huh?" she said, her tone dry. "Guessing that's not your real name." "Elias Carver," he admitted, offering a small, genuine smile. "I own the company. And I'm sorry, for what happened, for not knowing sooner." She studied him, then stepped aside. "Come in. You've got 5 minutes." Inside, he didn't sit. He stood, hands in his pockets, and laid it out. "Victor's gone. I fired him this morning. Your job's yours if you want it, full pay, back pay, everything. I should have protected you, and I didn't. I'm here to make it right." Margaret crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "Why? Guilt?" "No," he said. "Respect. You built that store as much as anyone. It's not the same without you." She didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted to the stack of books, then back to him. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But don't expect me to thank you yet." "Fair enough," Elias replied. He left her trailer with a nod, the weight of her words settling over him. She wasn't ready, not yet, but he'd wait. He'd earned her skepticism, and he'd earn her trust too, one step at a time. Back at the store, the crew watched him return, their faces brighter, their shoulders less slumped. Elias knew this was just the start. Margaret's return would be the real victory, and he'd move mountains to see it happen. The air in Store 17 felt different on the morning of March 25, 2025. The usual hum of fluorescent lights and the clatter of carts were still there, but beneath it ran a current of anticipation, a quiet buzz that pulsed through the small crew gathered near the entrance. Elias Carver stood among them, his suit jacket swapped for a simple button-down, sleeves rolled up, a man ready to work, not just command. 5 days had passed since he'd fired Victor Hensley, 5 days of relentless effort to rebuild what had been broken. The floors gleamed now, the shelves were fully stocked, and the staff moved with a purpose that hadn't existed a week ago. But today wasn't about policy changes or new hires. Today was about Margaret Ellison. Elias had called her the previous evening, his voice steady but hopeful. "The store's ready for you," he'd said. "If you're ready for it." There'd been a long pause on the line, the kind that stretched seconds into eternity, before Margaret replied, "I'll be there. 9 sharp." No fanfare, no promises, just her word. And that was enough. Now, as the clock ticked closer to 9, the employees lingered, their tasks forgotten. Jake leaned against the display of canned goods, his usual cynicism softened by curiosity. Tessa stood by the register, her fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the counter. Carla and Sam hovered near the break room door, whispering to each other, while a handful of newer hires watched from the sidelines, caught up in a story they'd only heard in pieces. Elias didn't hush them or urge them back to work. This moment belonged to them as much as it did to Margaret. At 8:58, a shadow moved beyond the glass doors. The chatter stilled, heads turning as one. The doors slid open, and Margaret stepped inside, her wiry frame draped in a faded blue cardigan and jeans that bore the creases of a life well lived. Her gray hair was pulled back, neater than Elias had seen it at the trailer, and her sharp eyes swept the store, taking in every detail. She carried a small canvas bag over her shoulder, nothing ostentatious, just the tools of her trade, a pair of work gloves, a battered thermos, a sense of purpose. The silence held for a beat, then Tessa broke it, stepping forward with a tentative smile. "Margaret," she said, her voice catching slightly. "You're back." Margaret nodded, her lips twitching into something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't far from it either. "Looks that way," she said, her tone dry but warm. Jake pushed off the display, crossing the floor to offer a hand. She shook it, then Carla's, then Sam's, each greeting a thread stitching her back into the fabric of the place. Elias watched from a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, letting the reunion unfold. This wasn't his moment to claim, it was theirs. But when Margaret's gaze finally landed on him, he stepped forward, meeting her halfway. "Welcome home," he said simply. She tilted her head, studying him. "Fancy words for a mop pusher," she replied, a glint of humor in her eyes. The crew chuckled, the tension easing into something lighter. Elias grinned, unbothered by the jab. He'd earned it. "I meant it," he said. "This place needs you. Always did." Margaret didn't respond right away. She turned, her eyes tracing the polished floors, the orderly shelves, the faces of the people she'd worked alongside for decades. "Looks different," she said finally. "Cleaner. Less like it's falling apart." "That's your doing," Elias said. "Even when you weren't here, they kept talking about how you'd fix things. I just followed their lead." She snorted softly, but there was no malice in it. "Don't flatter me, Carver. I'm not here for speeches." "Then why are you here?" he asked, genuinely curious. Margaret set her bag down, pulling out her gloves with a practiced ease. "Because this is my store," she said. "Not yours, not Victor's, mine. I built it, piece by piece, and I'm not done yet." The words hung in the air, a quiet declaration of ownership that went beyond titles or paychecks. Elias nodded, stepping back as she slipped on her gloves and headed toward the maintenance closet. The crew dispersed, returning to their tasks, but their steps were lighter, their voices brighter. Margaret was back, and with her came a piece of the store's soul they'd all thought lost. The day unfolded with a rhythm Elias hadn't seen in his undercover stint. Margaret moved through the aisles, inspecting pipes, tightening loose fixtures, scrubbing spots the crew had missed. She didn't bark orders or demand attention, she just worked, her hands steady and sure, reclaiming her domain. The others gravitated toward her, asking questions, sharing small updates. Tessa brought her a coffee from the break room pot, "Not that swill Victor used to make," she said with a grin. Jake lingered nearby, recounting a leak she'd fixed years ago that had stumped everyone else. Even Sam, the quiet teenager, shadowed her for an hour, absorbing her tricks like an apprentice. Elias stayed through the morning, not as a CEO but as a witness. He helped where he could, hauling a ladder for Margaret to reach a flickering light, carrying a stack of boxes for Carla, but mostly, he watched. This was what he'd fought for, what he'd torn Victor down to protect, a team that wasn't just surviving but thriving, held together by someone who'd given her life to it. By noon, he found Margaret in the back, tinkering with a temperamental heater that had rattled all week. She glanced up as he approached, wiping her hands on a rag. "You're still here," she said, not quite a question. "Wanted to see it through," he replied, leaning against the wall. "You settling in okay?" She shrugged. "It's not the same. New faces, new rules. But it's close enough." "Close enough to stay?" Margaret paused, her sharp eyes locking onto his. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." "Yeah, I'll stay. Long as you don't pull another stunt like firing me." "Never," Elias said, and he meant it. "You've got my word." She nodded, a small gesture of trust, then turned back to the heater. "Good. Now hand me that wrench." He did, and for the next half hour, they worked together in companionable silence, him passing tools, her coaxing the machine back to life. It was a small thing, but it felt like a bridge, a foundation for something stronger. When the heater hummed steadily again, Margaret stood, brushing off her hands. "Not bad for a suit," she said, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Not bad for a legend," he shot back, earning a rare chuckle from her. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Elias left store 17 that afternoon, the sun dipping low as he climbed into his car. He didn't linger, he had other locations to check, other fires to put out, but he carried something with him, the image of Margaret at work, the crew rallying around her, the store breathing again. It wasn't perfect, not yet. There were policies to enforce, managers to train, a culture to rebuild. But it was a start. Back in his penthouse that night, Elias stood at the window, the city sprawling below. The anonymous email that had sparked this journey sat open on his laptop, a reminder of how close he'd come to losing what mattered. He typed a reply, "Margaret's back. Store 17's on the mend. Thank you." And hit send, knowing it might never reach its source but needing to say it anyway. Then he turned away, his mind already shifting to the next battle. Carver Enterprises wasn't just a business, it was a promise, one he'd nearly broken but wouldn't again. Margaret had come home, and with her, so had he. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in years, Elias felt ready to walk it.